On. And we'll go to our program guest now. It's the Independent MP for New England, Tony Windsor, who joins us from Tamworth. Good morning. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Barry.
The Prime Minister is still short of the numbers that you'll need to get the flood levy through. What's troubling you about it?
Well, I'm still working through this. I have some difficulties with the imposition of a levy being the correct mechanism to raise the money to help the Queensland situation. Obviously, the money will come from somewhere, and eventually it'll come from the taxpayer one way or the other. But for the life of me, I can't understand why some of the budgetary reductions couldn't be looked at, or probably, preferably, in my case, a small deficit be run in terms of the budget. There seems to be this preoccupation with being back in surplus by 2012-13, and I don't think that's necessarily the correct course. I think when a disaster like this comes along, there's very good reason to slip into deficit.
Well, if that's true, then, if you think that she's doing this as a political imperative, how could you then support it in the end?
Well, I'm not saying I'm supporting it. I'm thinking about the various alternatives that are there, but I'd have to say, to be quite honest, that I'm not leaning towards it. I'm probably leaning against it.
And would you agree, though, that it's probably, even though the government's going to lose votes along the way, this one is important. It goes to the heart of their authority and their capability for doing things and getting things done.
Yes, but this is a hung parliament, and I have a vote within it. Won't be my vote that necessarily determines the outcomes of the government policy in this particular case, but I have to think through my vote in relation to this particular issue, and that's my first concern. The place it puts the government in terms of other votes is not my direct concern at this particular moment.
OK, Tony Abbott only recently suggested you should review your support for the government. You seem to be a bit offended by that, but doesn't it make sense to just periodically just take a look at the situation, take a step back and see how things are going?
Well, I think most people were doing that anyway, and I don't think we really needed Tony's advice in relation to that. I think he had another motive in mind. We've kissed and made up through the week. I had a meeting with Tony, and we're friends again. Well, I don't think we're ever not friends, but anyway, that episode's over.
Well, he said he had a very productive week. Perhaps that's what he was talking about, his conversation with you. After several months now, though, of the minority government, are you more or less persuaded that the government will run its full term?
I think it will. I think people were saying prior to Christmas that it'd all be over by Christmas. They're not saying that now. Obviously, there'll be the politics of the day because the numbers are very tight. That's by definition. So there will be the games played and the various media events run. But I think the government's putting itself in a position now where it's embarking on some long-term programs, the National Broadband Network, the Murray-Darling arrangements. That's a big thing in itself. The climate change debate. There's some pretty big topics out there, and on top of that, we've got these spate of disasters that have occurred right throughout Australia, and obviously that's taken the attention of the media and the nation. I think you could see that in the footage that you had of the parliamentarians. A very, very emotional time for everybody, and so there's a big year in front of us. To answer your direct question, I think there's a very good chance the government will run its course.
And of course, if that happens, that's in the interest of the independents, isn't it? Because that prolongs the period during which you have considerable influence.
Well, not necessarily. People will argue that if there's cases of maladministration or corruption, I'm sure all the crossbenchers would look at those things very seriously. But I don't think we're going to suddenly change the government, as Tony Abbott was suggesting on the back of a flood levy. I think we've got to sort of think through those things independently of what the government's particular position is. It's the Parliament's position that counts, and this is a Parliament of the people, not a Parliament of the executive. So I think everybody's got to really adjust their sights a little bit in relation to this particular Parliament. I think there's some fairly exciting times ahead.
Hey, I want to ask you about the youth allowance. The Coalition has sponsored a bill that boosts payments by more than $300 million, and that's designed, of course, to give a better deal to kids in the bush. Is that something you'd be tempted to support?
Well, I've been supportive of and I was very involved in this debate when it came up in the last Parliament, and was involved with trying to get some sort of regional package through one of the senators who walked away from it in the end. And I notice he's back in the game now, talking about resurrecting some of those initiatives that were raised then. But I think we've got to look at the broader context here of the legalities of it. Obviously, there's conflict between what the clerks of the Senate are saying and the clerks of the House of Representatives are saying. And I raised this with Tony Abbott as well, that I think we've got to work out what this means in terms of the Parliament, particularly the nature of this one, a hung Parliament, and how an issue like this can be worked through. If it can be worked through, I'd be in favour of the issue. If it can't, well, I think we've got to look at other means.
Right, because Julia Gillard is adamant about it. She says that it's unconstitutional, that the opposition cannot initiate money bills, and this involves money.
Well, that's been my historical knowledge of it, and I was in a hung parliament in New South Wales some years ago, and that was the rule back then. But some people are questioning the rule. The senator that introduced this particular piece of legislation is suggesting it may well be a transfer from the education fund over a three-year period. Now, what that means in terms of the context of appropriation and money bill, as we refer to it, that a member can't introduce a money bill other than a minister, I'm not certain. And I want to get that point cleared up before I get into the substantive issue, because if that can happen, if a money bill can be introduced from anywhere, obviously that has a much broader context in terms of the budget and the economy. So you could, in theory at least, you could have an opposition that's arguing that the government should never go into deficit, otherwise it'd be contrary to its own mantra, and then the opposition delivering money bills into the Parliament that drives the government of the day into deficit. So, and the consequent uncertainties that not only politically but economically that could flow from that. I think we've got to look at it in that much broader context rather than just picking one bill and saying this is a good idea, let's do it.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting one to watch. And on the Murray-Darling, and you're chairing the Parliamentary Committee, of course, Tony Abbott wants a postponement of the buybacks to save some money, and with so much water about, that would appeal to a lot of people.
Well, everybody's got a view on it. Just through this week, the committee made some interim recommendations to the Minister. One in relation to the buyback, not to taking it away altogether, but removing it from some of the irrigation districts where what is called a Swiss cheese effect of the buyback is occurring. So it has the consequence, pretty complex, Barry, so I won't try and explain it, but it has the consequence of leaving what's called stranded assets, running water past dry farms to get to wet farms. It really only applies in these irrigation districts where they're corporations. I think what Tony Abbott is suggesting, that the buyback be removed totally. Personally, I wouldn't agree with that. I think, and our recommendation to the Minister was that it be used in a more strategic sense, where it might be related to environmental icon sites or willing sellers that are outside these irrigation districts where you run into this problem with a Swiss cheese effect.
And as part of your parliamentary inquiry, why are you opposed to an investigation of the Water Act? Because you did say last October that it is a flawed piece of legislation.
Yes, but I don't think it's flawed for the reasons that some people have identified. I know it's an interesting diversion to question the Act, and the Act can be changed at any time. But some people were suggesting that our inquiry, in the terms of reference, include the Act. Well, the whole politics and debate would have been about the Act then. What we've found, and we were on the road for nearly a fortnight in January, and it's an excellent committee, actually. The Liberal, Labor and National people that are on it have all worked very effectively together. But what we've found is there's a few agri-political players suggesting it's all in the Act. But in the main, the people and the communities are saying they want the uncertainty removed. No one's saying there's not a problem out there. They're arguing about the extent of the problem and how you rectify it. And there's ways and means of rectifying this problem that are a fair way away from what the Murray-Darling Basin Authority was talking about. So there is a way through this. But Barry, I'll just bring you back to the substantive point. 5 governments and oppositions, the 4 states in the Commonwealth. It was John Howard that introduced this Act, and Barnaby Joyce, who wants to review the Act, had the balance of power in the Senate at the time. So there were 5 governments that agreed there was an issue in terms of the Murray-Darling system, and 5 oppositions. And in fact, I think I was the only one who voted against it in any of the parliaments. So, but that says to me that the substantive problem is something that needs to be addressed by those 5 parliaments. Now, we can tinker with the Act any day of the week. We've done it since the Act was put in place. So, but I don't think it should become the main game. The main game are the issues that are in the Murray-Darling. And the secondary game, in my view, and probably just as importantly, are the people who live within it. And they were treated very, very shabbily by the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. And I think we can overcome a lot of those issues through this committee and other processes.
Well, we're out of time, but Tony Windsor, thanks for your time this morning.
Thanks, Barry.